Hi, everyone. Welcome to this month's webinar. My name is Dr. Avril Lichardi, and I'm with LetPub and Accdon. I just want to make sure that everyone can hear me this morning. If you can say that you can hear me in the chat, that would be great.
I've got your audio and video just fine, AV. And it looks like for most people it's good. Just a reminder, if for some reason you are having difficulty, you can log out, log back in. That usually takes care of most issues, and just check your mic settings if you're having trouble, but it looks like we're working through Zoom.
Okay, great. So thank you, Clark. With me this morning is Dr. Clark Holdsworth, also with LetPub, and he's going to be helping monitor the chat throughout the webinar today, and then also participate in some question and answer at the end of the webinar. So again, I just want to welcome all of our attendees. I was perusing the chat, and it looks like we have a diverse audience from around the world, so that's very exciting. So thank you for joining us. I do want to highlight today that we are using Zoom for our webinar, and that allows us to have a variety of excellent functions. The first of which is the chat that all of you are engaging in right now. This is something that you can use to talk to fellow attendees throughout the webinar. And if there's any sort of technical problem, you can no longer see the screen, or you have audio issues, you can also indicate that there in case you might not be the only one having that problem. Another excellent feature of the webinar is the Q&A function. So when you do have a question pertaining to the content of the webinar, something to do with competitive proposal writing or grant funding that you want to ask either Dr. Holdsworth or myself at the end of the webinar, please insert that question into the Q&A. And at the end of the webinar, we will address those questions. If you do see that a fellow attendee has already asked the same question that you have, all you need to do is upvote that question. So you do not need to repeat the question if another attendee has already said that. All you need to do is upvote. The more upvotes a question has at the end of the webinar, the further it is going to be on the top of the list, and the more likely that we'll get to address those questions. Depending on the number of questions we have, we will, of course, try to get through all of them if time permits. Dr. Holdsworth, do you have any comments before we get started?
Yeah, just real quickly. So we do have a big number today. So we're looking at about a bit over 600 participants, which is in line with what we had for our session last month. So the webinar is growing quite extensively. Fortunately, we had a sponsor for the webinar today, PeerRef, which is a global networking platform for scientists. Their sponsorship allows us to keep this free for all of you, which is excellent for us. It's a platform that a few of our colleagues are working on. AV, I'm actually going to steal from you real quick. Oh, actually, no, that's okay. I won't bother backing out. But if you could, if you want to visit PeerRef, you can go to peerref.com. The platform has a couple useful tools, such as journal articles, a journal listing database, as well as an article database where you can comment, interact with authors, leave your experiences for other authors, or leverage their experiences to guide your own selections. So if you have time after this webinar, go ahead and check them out on peerref.com. Again, they're allowing us to keep this webinar free for you today, and we expect to be able to do that into the foreseeable future because of our generous sponsors. So other than that, one other sort of logistics thing I want to touch on. A lot of people are going to ask this throughout the webinar. We get it every time. This is being recorded on demand, so it's always going to be available for you. What you can do is the original confirmation email. So if you try to join this webinar afterwards, after we've finished up, that will take you to the recording. Simply go to your confirmation email, try to join the webinar. Since it's already been conducted, the on-demand will be available for you. If for some reason that doesn't work, you can also access the recording by going back to your original link for registration. If you go to your original registration link, whether you got it through an email from us or you went through the site, simply click on that. You can just re-register for the on-demand. That is also going to give you the recording, and you're free to use this recording for yourself. We will not have the slides, so we won't be sending any slides to you, but everybody from this webinar will be able to access the on-demand recording. If for some reason you are having trouble, keep in mind that this platform is Zoom. It's not through us, so we don't have control of it. So if you do have trouble, simply go to Zoom's Excellent Support. They'll be able to help you if you shoot them an email and need any technical issues with getting that recording resolved. But I just wanted to clear that up ahead of time. We'll revisit it with instructions again at the end in case you missed it.
All right, thank you, Clark. So again, today's webinar is on effective proposal writing to secure research funding. And this is, of course, a task that is common across all disciplines in academia and also outside of academia as well. And before we get started, I just want to do a brief introduction on my background, just so you get to know me a little bit better. Again, my name is Dr. Avriel Licciardi, and I'm an associate editor at Accdon-LetPub. Before joining Accdon, I got my master's in geology at the University of New Hampshire, and there I studied glacier change in the Andes of Peru. And then I went and did my PhD in the geological sciences at the University at Buffalo, again focusing on reconstructing glacier change using a variety of different methods, but this time on the mountain glaciers that exist around the Greenland ice sheet. And as part of my experience, in addition to research, I did a lot of grant writing and proposal writing throughout my tenure as both a master's and PhD student. And importantly, I got experience about how to write proposals for an international audience. So I'm going to be sharing some of that expertise with you today. And Dr. Holdsworth, would you like to introduce yourself as well? You may need to unmute yourself. We can't quite hear you. Perfect.
Thank you. Just like AV, I also have a research background. So I'm currently the research communications manager for LetPub, but prior to that, I earned my doctorate in physiology from Kansas State University at the veterinary medicine, College of Veterinary Medicine there. During that time, I focused primarily on partial pressure of oxygen, all the way from the top of the cascade, ambient pressure of O2 in the air, all the way down to the very, very low O2 pressures in muscle myoglobin. And we utilized several animal models of dysfunction. So a lot of preclinical work related to congestive heart failure and how that cascade can be disrupted. So that was my time in academia. And again, as I said, now I'm the research communications manager at LetPub. I'm actually going to mute and go out so AV can run through all her slides with you. I'll be keeping an eye on the chat, an eye on the Q&A, and so I'll try to curate this Q&A so that the most pertinent questions come up at the end, because it does look like we're going to end up having a lot through this. So one other thing I would like to remind you of, because I've already got a couple questions in the chat about it. We actually had a session last month that AV hosted, the writing response letters and dealing with the entire peer review process. In terms of these webinars, we are looking to try to get them up onto our website at letpub.com, which I'm sure many of you have visited. So what we're going to try to do is have that up. You can look for it within the next month before our following webinar. That last webinar we're looking to get up, and perhaps this one. So again, if you do also have trouble getting the on-demand recording, tune into letpub.com, go to the Learning Nexus, and we're looking to get this video content, these recordings up for you there as well. So they're on demand at all times. Just a brief reminder. So I'm going to let you go to it, AV. Just let me know if you have any comments you want me to share.
All right, great. Thank you. All right, so this is the outline for the webinar today. Again, this is a pretty big overarching topic, that being obtaining research funds to continue your experiments or just your research in general, something that many scientists face multiple times throughout their career. So I am framing this webinar as kind of what are the best tips and tricks for writing a competitive proposal and ultimately obtaining research funding, kind of in a standard way. Since we are all here with many different disciplines, of course, there are going to be intricacies within your specific field, but most of what I talk about today is probably something that you're going to encounter somewhere down the road. Today, I'm going to start with just going over the basics. What is the purpose of a research proposal, the stages of development, and also what is the review process like once you finally submit that proposal to that funding agency or institution. I'm also going to touch on some tips for developing your research agenda as well as your proposal idea. Again, I can't develop your specific agenda and proposal idea myself because I'm not necessarily within your field, but I do have some questions and maybe ways to stimulate you thinking about which direction you want to go. I'm going to spend a lot of time reviewing the expected proposal content and elements. So these are things that are shared among different proposals of all disciplines, and ways that you can make your proposal stand out among others. And in the end, I'm going to touch on some common proposal writing mistakes and, of course, how you can avoid them to make your proposal more competitive. And then finish up with some insider tips from a professor and prior panel member on some of the biggest funding agencies that we have here in the United States. And of course, we'll have live Q&A at the end. So again, as Clark mentioned, if you do have questions related to the content of the webinar, please put them in the Q&A function throughout the presentation today and upvote any questions that you would really like to be answered. So the main question here is, what is the purpose of a research proposal? And again, this is not just in academia, but a lot of my focus today will be on the academic realm. So academics typically write research proposals to secure funding for their projects. This is to keep your experiments going, to support students, and the like. I am going to be talking about research proposals that go down to the graduate student level. This is where many of you, myself included, first got our experience writing research proposals. And oftentimes you have to write a proposal for your master's thesis or your PhD dissertation to get approval to have your research move forward. This is also the case if you're doing a PhD or a master's and you need smaller amounts of money to complete some analyses or do some field work, for example. And an important thing to know when you're writing a research proposal is that all proposals are designed to persuade somebody. And that's going to either be your supervisor to allow you to do your dissertation work, the institution that you're working at to give you money and support, or a specific funding body that you're looking for, maybe a more large scale or complex project. And you need to persuade those people or those funding bodies that your project is simply worthwhile. It's worth their time and their investment. So the next question is, what are your proposal aims? What do you need to do in a very general context to write a competitive proposal? There's kind of 4 key points here. The first is relevance, and that is your project relevant? You need to convince your reader that not only is your project interesting, but it is important, not just to you and your small community, but perhaps to society. And of course, that your science and your research is original. You also need to provide context, specifically for your reader of the proposal. And in doing so, you're also going to showcase your skills. You'll illustrate your familiarity with the field, that you understand that the hot topic or the hot research area, as well as your knowledge on the topic, and that you've also done a strong literature review, that your ideas are grounded within the literature and a strong academic basis. Now, a main part of a proposal is coming up with an idea and saying how you're going to do it. And you do need to have a well thought out approach. So you can't just say, I'm going to use method A to complete this project. You need to make the case for your methods and explain them in detail. And this has you have to be showing how you carefully contemplated the data, which tools you need, and what procedures are necessary to obtain the best results. And lastly, but definitely quite important, is that you need to show that your work is feasible. This is a big reason why a lot of proposals are rejected, and it's because the author of the proposal is trying to get too much done. It's not an actual feasible project. Your goals are a little bit too high for the amount of money you're asking for, or just for the time allotted to complete the research. So you need to confirm that your project is possible within a variety of different constraints, and we'll go through those. But these are often put out by the funding agency, the program within that institution or funder, or your university itself. And another common question is, how long is a typical research proposal? And unfortunately, I can't quite answer that question because the length of grants and proposals vary dramatically. Within the same field, they vary depending on the institution. It could be as simple as 1 page, or it could be very in-depth for a much larger scale proposal, like a National Science Foundation sort of proposal. So I just want to touch on the review process a little bit as well before we get into kind of the core of the webinar today. One of the main tips that I want to provide you with is to make sure your project fits the funding program. So this is kind of analogous to making sure that your manuscript fits the scope of a journal that you're submitting to. You want to make sure that you're submitting your proposal to the right place. This will, of course, increase your chances of getting your research funded. Now, let's just say you got a proposal all the way together, it's tightened up, it's ready to go, it's polished, and then you submit it to your funding agency of choice. The first thing that's going to happen is also very similar to the journal review process, is that it's going to go through a formalities check by the project officer. And this is simply to ensure that your proposal aligns with the guidelines of that funding agency. So again, just like writing a manuscript, you do need to make sure that your proposal is formatted correctly. It includes all the right sections, and it aligns to the requirements. If your proposal passes that stage, the project officer will then send your proposal to a field of external reviewers or panel members or a review committee. There's a variety of different terms for this. And these are typically experts in your field. However, they may not be experts in your field, but perhaps laterally associated. As such, you need to make sure that your language is clear and coherent throughout your proposal to make sure that everyone understands your primary research question and how you're going to address it. Those external reviewers will then provide a review of your proposal as well as recommendations, meaning should it get funded? Is it, not the best proposal, but not poor, or should it be rejected? They will then send those recommendations to the review committee and the project officer, who will then decide on a priority list for funding. Usually there's a large amount of proposals that are submitted to each program, and this review committee will actually create a priority funding list with the strongest proposals at the top. However, it is important to note and to consider your budget when you are making a proposal. And again, we'll get into this in a little bit more depth, but even though your proposal might be strong, it can be rejected due to budget constraints of that funding agency. So really contemplating about your budget, especially if you're collaborating with others, is something that should be of high consideration when you're writing. So in terms of the stages of proposal development, this award cycle that I'm showing here is a little bit more pertinent to large-scale complex proposals. But in general, as a scientist, you will seek out funding opportunities, which is that smaller red circle that you see in front of you. You'll then develop a proposal and write that proposal, and then submit that proposal to your funding agency. And that's really the core of today's webinar, really the latter two, proposal development and proposal submission. If your proposal is funded, you would then move into the circles that are of the cooler colors, the blues and purples, which would involve making sure that you keep the funding agency up to date on your progress, making sure that you keep any associates, students, researchers that are associated with your project in line and making sure that they're getting their work done. And also addressing some complications that might come along the way. You are allowed to ask for extensions in getting your research done. When you have a proposal, you're not going to get more money, but if you need another year to get your research done, you can always do that. So that would be like the renewal process. And then eventually, after you complete your research and your funding runs out, you would be closing out your project. But to focus on the proposal development of today, here is just a kind of a simple overall flow chart of what happens once you generate your research idea. So again, the first step of a proposal is coming up with an idea. Once you do that, we strongly recommend that before you even really start writing, you identify a funding program and specifically the objectives of that funding program. Funders will put out requests for proposals, but they often fall into certain categories. So they have a solicitation for certain aspects that must be covered in each proposal. So you want to make sure that you're aware of those before you start really getting into the nitty-gritty of writing. From there, you kind of have three avenues. The one on the left will be development of the proposal itself, coming up with a conceptual framework, planning, and then ultimately writing and preparing your proposal. The center here is what I've called proposal formatting. So that's really just making sure that your proposal gets done in time in terms of the deadlines. If there are deadlines for certain aspects of your proposal to that funding agency, you want to make sure you meet those. Perhaps there's some information requests you need to make to the university for questions, to the agency. You want to make sure you do that. And then you want to, of course, abide by a timeline. You do not want to procrastinate with proposals. They take quite a long time to put together. And then there are always administrative tasks involved in the proposal process. You're very likely going to have to create a budget as well as a budget justification. This is something that graduate students start learning about when they write proposals early on. If you do any sort of field work or any other research that requires approval from any institution or a permit, you'll also have to obtain those and show that you've done that before submitting your proposal. And then there's going to be approval probably on your university or institution side as well. So there are going to be, paperwork that you'll need to fill out before you even submit your proposal moving forward. So overall, it's very important to understand the entire funding process and the expectations and well as the timeline of what you're working with. So moving forward, the next question is, you have an idea, but how do you start your research proposal? Well, the first thing is what we call developing your research agenda. So the best way to start with this is taking from your thesis or dissertation work. This is often the foundation for academics or scientists in terms of developing the research agenda moving forward. And what we recommend here is that perhaps throughout your graduate career, you're at conferences or you're listening to a speaker in your own department, and there are questions and curiosities that arise. It may be related to your own research. It may be a conversation you had in the hallway. But I think it's important that you keep track of these questions, and then you can return to them in the future. So these can often, form a proposal idea down the road. So think about, why is a certain point that you heard in the talk interesting to you? And is this something that you could connect with your work? Something that you yourself could turn into an idea, or perhaps a potential collaboration down the road? It's also important as a researcher to identify kind of a big overarching question that you're working toward. It might not be the question that your research will ultimately answer, but it's probably something that your research is contributing to. And from there, you can kind of generate a cascade of other questions that maybe your research can more directly address. And then another big question is, you need to decide if you're going to build on what you have studied previously. Most researchers do if they decide to continue on in graduate school from a master's to a PhD, and then even more so to a postdoc and a faculty member. Most people build on what they've studied, but usually in a little bit of a different way, such as, are you going to use different methods than you did during your master's for your PhD, but address a similar question to perhaps provide more concrete support for your master's research or a calibration of some sort? Are you going to step out and address an unexplored topic in your field, which is also a very exciting avenue? It's also important to understand that your mentors and your advisors are there for you. So if you come up with an idea, you should not hesitate to ask them for their advice, whether or not they think the idea is feasible or would be interesting to the community. In terms of developing your research agenda, it's also important to consider projects that you yourself can lead. Now, I'm not saying that you should not collaborate with people. Collaboration is absolutely essential, and it's probably the most likely way that you will get your proposal funded moving forward, at least for higher up proposals, larger scale proposals. But you should always be conducting research that will ultimately support the career or professional path that you want to take. You don't want to be spending time and money investing in something that isn't necessarily the career you want down the road. So along those lines, it's important to always be thinking ahead. What are your goals? Are you simply looking for pilot data to start another proposal down the road? Are you looking to obtain research funding to bolster up your CV in terms of promotion or tenure? So it is good to always have goals and then work towards them, and writing proposals of different lengths, different caliber, and to different funding agencies is a way to get there. So the next question is, once you've developed your research agenda, you need to think about your proposal idea. So we're moving from the bigger kind of umbrella concept of the research agenda down to developing your idea that's going to be ultimately your writing task. And I've set out here kind of 4 subsets of questions that I think is important to ask yourself at the beginning of the process. And all of these are important because they're going to be components that reviewers are looking for when they review your proposal. First off is, will the proposed project contribute to the field? Just like manuscripts, you need to have some sort of contribution to the literature or to moving the scientific field forward. So kind of along those lines, you can ask yourself, what questions are being addressed in the field right now? And does my project align with those questions or some of the big overarching questions of your research discipline? Question 2 is, how does this proposal complement or build on your existing research? And again, what are some of those unanswered questions from your previous research? Many of us in the end of our manuscripts say future studies should include X, Y, Z. Oftentimes we do that because we might have another supplemental paper coming along, or you can do that to have a good setup for writing a proposal. So what those questions are can obviously be a continuation and a new proposal moving forward. And then question 3 is, again, is this proposed project that you're going to be involved in moving you closer to your professional goal? So again, you do need to think about yourself here and your career path. And then question 4 is one that kind of more relates to the funding agencies itself, but that is a very important component of writing a competitive proposal. And do your research questions respond to the request or the solicitation for proposals by the funding agency that you're submitting to? So is your proposal within the scope of what the funding agency is looking to fund for research? So again, do your ideas align with the funding agency's portfolio? That is something that is very important to keep in the back of your mind. So in terms of developing your idea, for some more general tips here, it's very good to start with preliminary or pilot research if you have that available. This is something that provides kind of a proof of concept of your idea. And you can use previous research that you've done and published as pilot research for a larger scale proposal. In addition to either having or not having pilot research, you should always be conceptualizing your project. So at a very basic view, you need to think about how you're going to do the work and how to not only just present your findings to the scientific community and to the public, but also how it will specifically benefit the field. A good way to develop an idea is to conduct a very thorough literature review to identify whether similar work exists regarding your proposal idea or not. If work has already been done, then your idea is probably not going to be as novel and interesting to the reviewers. However, if you do identify gaps or limitations in content or methods in the literature, that's something that you can turn around into a proposal. Another way to think about this is if research has been done, decades ago on a certain topic, and now there's a variety of new methods and techniques that would more accurately address that original research question, you can still also return to that as well. Another tip is, of course, to involve your peers. If you do formulate a proposal idea, it's totally okay to get feedback from your peers to assess whether or not your proposal idea is interesting and innovative, and whether or not there's a need for that work within the community. And another point here is that, again, a strong proposal often requires more expertise than just an individual researcher or even an institution has, which is why on many proposals there's multiple principal investigators or main researchers from a variety of different institutions working together. So again, collaboration is common. And then 2 other suggestions for developing your proposal idea. The first one is that you can reach out to successful grant recipients. Someone might be your advisor, for example, that would have very good insight into how to obtain research funding. This would allow you to learn the process that led them to obtaining a successful proposal and getting funds. And they may even share an example of their funded proposal with you, which is an invaluable resource moving forward. And then last but not least, if you have a well-developed idea and perhaps you're a little bit further along in your research, you can always share your concept with a program director via email. This is specifically for larger funding agencies or maybe smaller organizations. If they do welcome kind of a check to see if your proposal aligns with that of the agency, I would recommend doing so, because just like a journal editor, if you ask them to see if your manuscript is within the scope, you can do the same thing for a research proposal. So now that you've kind of got the basic grounds for just starting a research proposal in terms of the conceptual framework and maybe some ideas of how to get started, the next question is how to write one, which is, I think, a very big question that all of us have either currently had, will have. It's something that I still work on today myself. So a really big, important point to make, even though I have been making analogies to the manuscript submission process, is that writing a proposal is very different from drafting a publication. And I don't necessarily just mean this in terms of the writing style, so the type of language that you use in a proposal, but also some of the requirements and expectations. Regardless of your discipline, you must know that all proposals need to include what you plan to accomplish, why you want to do it, also why it's incredibly important, and how you're going to do it. Clarity and detail are absolutely critical when writing a proposal. Similar to a manuscript, you have to ensure coherence between all sections of the proposal. This is because a reviewer is not guaranteed to start reading your proposal right at the beginning and read it through to the end. They may jump around a little bit, so you need to make sure that your main questions are articulated throughout and that your reading is clear, or your writing is clear. And although it is somewhat unfortunate news, the success of a research proposal depends not only on the quality of your proposed project and the relevance of your research questions, but it does also depend on the quality of the writing. A good research project, just like a strong manuscript, can be rejected simply based on the fact that the proposal is poorly written. So this is something that as researchers and scientists, we all do need to pay attention to, which is clearly articulating our ideas with strong English language. And remember, you are selling your work to the reviewers. So again, you are kind of advertising your science with a proposal, which is one of the main differences between that and a publication. So in terms of kind of the, some, I guess, overarching general proposal content and expectations is that it's very important to demonstrate throughout your proposal how your approach is novel, transformative, and trusted. So do the reviewers honestly believe that your work is going to be able to be done with the information that you're providing them? So again, you need to convince the reviewers of your proposal that there's a need for your research, that this need relates to a problem of considerable importance, and that you have an approach to address the problem, and that you yourself are the best person to carry out that research. Because there could be somebody else that also has an approach to address the same problem. So you need to make your case that you yourself doing the work the way that you have set it out is the best way to move forward, and that those funders should invest in your idea and your concept. Again, you want to be detailed in how you will move from the initial implementation of your project to the final stage. Reviewers are looking for the entire arc of your proposed research project within the proposal itself. So you need to demonstrate clearly how you will accomplish what you're proposing, how you can do so with your requested budget, and of course, why you are qualified. And another important tip here is that you do want to write for the highest expert in the field, and that's in terms of the substance and context of your work. But it's very important to use language that can be understood by everyone that's going to be on the panel. You do not need to write it for a lay audience, for the public, for example. That's not what I mean. But I mean that there might be a diverse panel of experts to review your proposal. So there's probably going to be someone that's specifically within your field, but then there's someone that's laterally associated with your field that might not know all the ins and outs of the technical methods. But they need to be able to understand why your research is important, even though they might not be researching that exact question themselves. For those cases, it's important to provide examples, and that might help reviewers that are unfamiliar with concepts. And again, you don't need to specifically simplify your research, you just need to make the text clear, accessible, and concise. Again, it's also very important that if you do have any preliminary data, you can use that to build a case for why your work is important. You can use your pilot data to analyze your dissertation data differently. And again, preliminary data is something that reviewers really look for because it shows evidence of promise for your project idea. If you put yourself in the reviewer's shoes and they're trying to decide who's going to receive, say, $1 million for research, which is a large sum of money, they're going to want to feel very confident before they give you that award that your research is going to be fruitful in the end. So again, if you have preliminary data to show that there is promise for your research, that will be very beneficial. And then another tip here is to simply be realistic about your project. This can be the fall for a lot of researchers when submitting proposals. Reviewers often question the feasibility of someone's research design and whether their acquired data will justify their investment in your research. So don't, just like you wouldn't want to say conclusions in a manuscript that aren't supported by your data that you present in the results, it's the same thing for a proposal. You can't promise anything that isn't within the boundaries of your budget or your research question. So in this pretty long list that I have up here right now are the common proposal elements that you might encounter when writing. I tried to make this fairly inclusive for all the different disciplines that we have here joining us today. So again, it is a pretty perhaps overwhelming list. Many of these things are probably something similar that you've seen for a manuscript, starting with a title page. You might have a certification page or just some sort of paperwork associated with the funding agency. This would be followed by something like an abstract or a project summary. And then the core of your proposal is probably going to fall under a title called project description. And this can include anything from the introduction to the literature review to your methods, any preliminary data you have. So this will kind of be really the core of the proposal that you write. Another important component or element of a proposal will be the significance, implications, and broader impacts. So again, how your proposal is truly going to make a difference. And then something that's not typically associated with a manuscript that's more associated with a proposal is a research schedule, a budget and budget justification, information on facilities, equipment, things like that that you might need, and any other sources of support that you're going to have. So I'm not going to go through all of these different components in detail, but I am going to go through a few of the bigger ones that really provide or that could sway your proposal from being funded or not funded. The title page, of course, is fairly straightforward. Like a manuscript, your title should be concise and descriptive. Proposals can be a little bit, you can have maybe a little bit more interesting title, perhaps some questions in your title, things like that, depending on the funding agency that you're going for. Importantly, you need to make sure that everything associated with your title page conforms to the requirements of the funder, similarly for what you would do for journal requirements. Next would be your abstract or project summary. This is typically either the length of an abstract or maybe a one-page summary of your project. This can be one of the hardest things to write because you have to be extremely concise, trying to bring everything in from your proposal in a clear and concise manner to kind of hook your reviewers right from the start. This would be all your key questions, the aims of your proposed research, the methods or research design, and of course the impact of the project itself. The abstract and project summary is often how the funding agency selects reviewers. So they'll, based on what you say in your abstract, will identify which reviewers are going to be used for your proposal review. So it is very important that you are clear in your objectives and your research, because then you're going to get a reviewer that's more aligned with your research discipline, which could ultimately help you get better reviews or funded down the road. And I personally like to always write the abstract for my manuscripts after I write my whole manuscript itself. And so I also suggest that you write this abstract or project summary after you've compiled the rest of the proposal. The next section that you'll likely write for a proposal is the introduction. And this is one of the most critical sections of your proposal, again, because you really need to hook the reviewer and make them excited to continue reading. It's important to understand that your proposal is going to be probably in a very competitive pool, perhaps even with proposals suggesting similar research. So you need to make your proposal stand out and exciting to those reviewers, kind of catch their eye after they've been, reading through multiple documents at once. It's important in your introduction to introduce the problem, your proposed solution, your research questions, and your methodology. But again, just introduce these things. You'll be using the sections later on that follow this to really go into explicit detail about all of those specific components. One of the essential components of an introduction is to provide necessary background and context for your research problem. And this is one of, I'd say, the most difficult things to do for a proposal. How to frame the research question is often the biggest problem in proposal writing. Many of us get lost in the literature review, and as a result, our research question may appear trivial or uninteresting. So my advice to you is to try to place your research question in the context of a hot research area or a research area that's receiving a lot of attention. Alternatively, you can return to a research area that is kind of always ongoing in the background, always still of interest, but might not be addressing the biggest question in your field of discipline at present. After the introduction, you may have a literature review. Alternatively, the literature review may be incorporated into your introduction or background section. But it's still important to have this component for a variety of reasons, which I've bulleted here. Number one, you give credit where credit's due to previous investigators. You demonstrate your knowledge of the research problem as well as your understanding of any important issues related to your questions. It shows that you're up to date on the literature as well as your ability to evaluate the relevant literature. And most importantly, the literature review will identify that important issue, how you're going to resolve it, and whether or not it's a major gap in the literature. So you need to frame it so that you ultimately convince your reader that your proposed research will make a substantial contribution to the field. Your proposed research will fill that gap in the literature that you just wrote about, or it will resolve that controversial issue that's been debated about for years. This is where you need to do that and kind of set that up early on in your proposal. Before you move into how you're going to do that, so that would be your methods and research design, you do want to kind of restate your hypotheses, your aims, objectives, really to bring the focus back to your project. You'll have spent a lot of time discussing previous studies. You want to bring that back and make sure that your reviewer is, again, focused on your question that you're going to address. Moving on to methods and research design. This is simply the part of your proposal where you show how you're going to tackle your research problem that you have set up strongly in the introduction or literature review section. Here you're going to be providing a work plan and describing the activities necessary for completion of your project. Importantly, you need to provide enough context so that reviewers can assess whether or not your methodology is sound and appropriate for your research question. Another very important component of a proposal is it's not necessarily sufficient enough just to say that you're going to use method A because it's been proven in the past. You want to demonstrate your knowledge of alternative methods, so methods B and C, but then you want to say why method A outshines methods B and C, because it's more appropriate and because it's a better way to address your research question. So again, it's kind of going above and beyond to provide support for your research versus just saying kind of a straight statement. In addition to that, you want to describe your data management plan in detail. So data management plans are something that's a little bit new in the open access realm of publishing these days. A lot of times you need to have a data availability statement, for example, at the end of a publication. If you kind of go back in time when you write your proposal, you need to say how you're going to make your data available. This is required for some funding agencies, not for others. So again, read your guidelines. But if it is required, you need to go down to the details. What is the data that you're going to collect? How is it going to be stored? Is it going to cost you money to do that? And how will it be shared? All of your agencies are going to be looking into this information. And again, if you have preliminary data, you can include this in your methods section kind of as a methods results to, again, provide promise for your proposed work. And then throughout your research design, I kind of have 4 bullet points here. Again, these are more like questions to get you thinking about what to include in this methods research design section. At the very basic level, you need to identify what research type you're going to be doing, qualitative versus quantitative. Are you going to be collecting original data or perhaps working with primary, secondary sources? And then what type of research design are you ultimately going to be using? In terms of sources, what are you exactly going to study? How are you going to select samples, subjects to use in your research or sources themselves? When and where are you going to be collecting the data? For the methods, of course, what tools, instruments, analyses are you going to use? And again, really emphasize why those specific tools and procedures you've selected are the most appropriate to answer your questions. And then last but not least, it's important to think about the practicalities or the logistics of completing your research. How much time are you going to need to collect the data? For me as a geologist, do I need to do field work? Most likely. How am I going to run my experiments? What if there are issues with gaining access to a place you need to go? And along those lines, do you foresee potential obstacles? And if so, how will you address them? This latter point is incredibly important. This is something that reviewers will reject a proposal on if a researcher kind of doesn't have a plan B or C to follow plan A. Because as many of us know, in science, things don't always go the way that we want them to go. So it's always good to have a contingency plan and a way to address that within your proposal itself. That will be something that puts your proposal above others. So kind of jumping over some of the other sections, another really important section of your proposal will be where you address any significance or broader impacts of your research. And this is kind of a part of a proposal that's way more substantiated compared to, say, a manuscript itself or a publication. Importantly, a project's intellectual merit or broader impacts can basically make or break whether or not a proposal is competitive among others. This is somewhere where you want to review your funder's guidelines. So what was their request for the proposal? You want to bring your broader impact back specifically to what is written in that solicitation request from the funding agency. It's important here to be cautious with how much you claim your project can accomplish. Just like any sort of experimental study, it will have limitations. So your proposal will have limitations, and it's important to be honest about them. Again, you're going to be reviewed by experts in your field, and they're going to be able to identify these limitations because they have a similar background to you. Do not just describe what you're going to do. You need to describe how it's going to make a difference. So think about who is going to be impacted by this work. Why should society care? Why should the public care about your research? And again, how does your work contribute to moving your scientific field forward? Other impacts that you could think about incorporating into your research are whether or not it improves processes in the specific location or field. Does your work have information for policymakers, for informing policy? Are you working towards strengthening a theory or improving on a model? And of course, most likely your proposal is going to create a basis for further research down the road. So you can think about kind of tuning those general concepts to your individual proposals. Another incredibly important part of a proposal that is not something that you see in a manuscript is the budget. And simply put, the budget demonstrates the costs for each component of your project. And it's important to make sure that your budget reflects all activities mentioned in your proposal. The budget can also make or break whether or not a proposal is funded. If your budget is too low, reviewers will know that certain components of your project won't actually be able to be done, or they won't be able to be done well, and therefore they'll reject your project. Alternatively, if your budget is too high, red flags will be raised by the reviewers. They'll question why you're asking for so much money. Budgets often get very high due to salary for faculty members or things like that. So that's something that you really have to think about. So it is kind of it's a balance, and it's a difficult balance to get to, especially if you have multiple collaborators. Importantly, you need to make sure that your budget makes sense. For example, don't propose collecting more data than you propose costs to analyze within your budget. Your costs must fit the project. And it's also important to check what types of costs the funding body will agree to cover. The funding agency might only, for me, for example, for geology, they may only cover aspects for fieldwork and not analyses. So you need to make sure that you're budgeting for the appropriate things that you are requesting related to the guidelines of your funding agency. So again, here I pose some questions for you when you're thinking about putting together your budget. So in order to determine your budget, think about travel costs, not only travel associated with collecting data, but also if you plan to attend international conferences down the road, how much that will cost. Materials, if you have a lab, do you need to think about reagents and consumables to do your analyses? If you're going to need assistance with your research, are you going to be funding a PhD student, a couple of graduate students, some undergraduates, and then time. If you're an established faculty member and you need to take leave to accomplish your project, are you going to need to supplement your salary for this additional work? So these are all components that you do need to think about when budgeting. And then for each budget item, consider how much money you're going to need, why that cost is specifically necessary, and the agency is going to want to know how you calculated that amount. So you'll need to provide sources. And another component is the research schedule. This is something that may or may not be required by your funding institution when you're writing a proposal, but sometimes you will need to provide a timeline of your project, basically explaining what you will do at each stage and how long each of those stages will take. Common kind of phases of a schedule include perhaps just background research and literature review, research design and planning, your data collection, then your data analysis, the writing period for your publications, and then also the revision process. So another kind of thinking forward, a component for the budget would also be whether or not you're going to be having any publishing costs. So you'd also want to include that there, which would be part of your research schedule. So those are the main kind of big components or elements of a proposal that you need to focus on. Those are where you're going to really sell your research and advertise your study to the reviewers. And while it may be a bit overwhelming, I think there's a lot that go into proposals. So I want to offer you some kind of common mistakes in a proposal so that as you sit down and start drafting your work, coming up with your proposal idea, you know certain things to avoid. So the list that I put together here are some of kind of the main reasons that people get rejected in terms of their proposal. The first one is if you have poor time management. A proposal does not come together overnight. So please ensure that you have enough time to prepare a polished proposal. A reviewer will see kind of the messy details and missing materials, which is something that I have down the list here, as a sign of someone that didn't put their heart and soul into their proposal. Feasibility issues is another really big one. Again, do not be unrealistically ambitious with your proposal in terms of the significance or impacts or the amount of data you're going to collect. Another simple one that a researcher should always be aware of is, again, if your proposal doesn't meet the formatting requirements or the eligibility requirements of the funding institution, unfortunately, you'll be rejected outright. So again, always check the guidelines before getting started. If you have a lack of a concrete research plan with few projected outcomes or alternative measures, so perhaps your proposal isn't necessarily as evolved as it could be. If there's no compelling scientific question or hypothesis, this can be a red flag for reviewers. And then of course, if your budget and justification is poor or inappropriate, and then for larger scale funding agencies, they often want you to have some sort of outreach component integrated. So again, if you don't have any sort of educational or outreach activities included in your proposal, that can also lead to rejection sometimes. So rejection is hard for everybody. I think in academia, it's something that we face quite often, so it can be very difficult. But again, just understand that you're not alone, that we all get proposals rejected at some point in our careers. I myself have definitely gotten proposals rejected, but there is kind of a silver lining to it. Sure, failure is part of the experience, but please know that most researchers submit their proposals several times before getting funded. To these really big funding agencies, for example, the National Science Foundation for the United States, most researchers submit their proposals on average 3 to 4 times before they are funded for that specific project. The silver lining that I mentioned before is that you get to build on rejected proposals. It is so much easier to start writing a proposal when you have text in front of you. You get to edit a proposal that you already spent time on versus staring at a blank screen. That is, in my opinion, definitely a silver lining to it. You also get to build on comments from reviewers to make it stronger. Because again, you can always revise and resubmit. It's also important to know that when you submit your proposal, it will go to that review committee or that round of expert reviewers. And they're typically only reviewed by one committee. So if you submit again, you may receive different feedback the second time. And then lastly, you need to ensure that you've submitted to the appropriate funder or program. Again, if you consider submitting to a different program than the one that you perhaps got recently rejected from, it's important to revise your proposal so that it's responsive to that new program solicitation. It's probably going to be a little bit different than the last one, and it's not as simple as just taking your proposal, making no edits, and then resubmitting again. You will have to do some revisions in between. So before we move on to Q&A, which I see we have a good deal of questions to address, I want to provide you with some insider tips from a top proposal reviewer. This individual has reviewed proposals for some of the top funding agencies in our country and has reviewed over hundreds of proposals as well. They say that the best proposals, the ones that get funded, typically combine technique development with creative applications to answer scientific questions. So again, an interdisciplinary proposal are the ones that get to the top of the list. Just as I stated, most proposals get rejected on the first round. This individual's proposals have been rejected numerous times. But what's really important is that you want to show that you've made effort to revise your proposal specifically to that project officer who is probably going to be seeing it again. So you want to show that you completed your revisions and acknowledge that upon your resubmission. This is very important. They also say that the proposals that are the most highly rated are those for innovative research over ones that may be addressing the same question they addressed previously, but using just only a slightly different technique or a well-established technique. A lot of funding agencies want to see transformative research. So it's good for you to kind of think outside the box. Another excellent tip here is that before you even start writing, you should browse the funded proposals to see what type of research is being funded by your current, the funder that you're wishing to submit to. This may not be available for all types of funding agencies. Most likely this would be for public agencies or publicly funded agencies. But this is how you're going to identify that hot topic in the research area and kind of what that agency is interested in funding at the moment. Again, there are trends and it will benefit you to follow those trends. And then again, similar to submitting a manuscript to a journal, you are allowed, when you submit for proposal review, to list reviewers that you'd like to review your proposal. And you can also list reviewers that you would not like to look at your proposal. So these would be blacklisted reviewers. You should take advantage of this opportunity. It will help you identify biased or fiercely competitive researchers. Funding agencies do understand that this is a case, and if someone is bias against your research that are not going to offer a fair review. So if it is allowed, we strongly recommend that you list suggested and blacklisted reviewers for when you submit your proposal. So with that, I think it would be good to get into the Q&A. I went for about an hour or a little bit less on that presentation. So if Dr. Holdsworth wants to join us again, we'd both be very happy to address the questions that you've put forward.
Great job, AV. So I'm not too proud to admit that I learned a ton there. That was probably one of our most informative sessions so far. We've done a lot of these now. That was excellent. That's a lot of excellent material on a topic that I know people find difficult. A grant proposal is like a step up in terms of the stringency of the evaluation for a manuscript, and we already have trouble with manuscripts, obviously, so this was super helpful. Some of the pertinent questions are like logistics that I'm going to deal with quickly first, and then I'll ask you some of the detailed questions related to the grants.
Sure.
But we have a question about certificate of attendance, which we absolutely have for you. We got this question the first time in our last webinar. This is something that people want, so we do have that available for you. If you're free to list this, if you want to list it simply in like an educational experience in your CV or something, you need to list it somewhere in like your tenure files or that type of thing. You can go ahead and list us because we have records. If somebody needs to confirm that, an employer or a supervisor, something like that, we'll confirm that for them. But if you do want something up front, we can do a certificate for you. You just send an email to us. The email address is provided at the end, and we'll give you a certificate that has the name of the webinar and the date for you. So we can get that in your hands. For the other question about webinars, this is from people who attended our last webinar and also people who are attending today. This is recorded as a reminder. So we are recording this webinar for you. It's recorded to Zoom. So it's within the Zoom platform. We don't have a downloadable file, but it's recorded to Zoom on the cloud. If you need to access it, you already have the email. You don't need us to email it to you. Just go back to your original confirmation email. So the same link that you clicked to join this presentation today, just click that link. If the presentation's done, Zoom automatically takes you to the recorded version of the webinar, and it's available on demand for you. So also, if for some reason that doesn't work, I'm actually going to screen share real quick, AV.
Yeah, go for it.
So if you go to letpub.com, you can, if for some reason, maybe you lost your confirmation email, something like that, the link that you have to it, just go back to it. We leave the webinar up for a little while, so you can see our May free webinar is here. All you have to do is just fill out the registration again very quickly, and that's going to allow you to get the on-demand version, even if you missed it, whatever, don't have your link, that type of thing. I think we also have it on the journal selector tool, yep, right here. So either of those places, just go back and get the original registration, re-register, takes a second, and you'll get the on-demand version. So you do have the recordings. I just want to emphasize that. The only thing is, so PowerPoint slides will not be available. So if you email us about those, unfortunately we don't have it, but we will send you, again, the instructions to get the full recording of this entire session, and you can use that however you want. So we will have it. Also, as I mentioned at the beginning, the Learning Nexus. Actually, sorry, let me go back one more time, maybe. If you go into our Learning Nexus here, go to the core on letpub.com, go to the Learning Nexus. We're going to be trying to put up some of these past webinars on here, and then they'll be available indefinitely, but we need to get them off Zoom for you. And so you'll be able to just even share this link with someone instead of having to send them the full file. So look for these in the future over the next month. We're looking to upload this one and the one that we had before so that you guys can take a look at those. Okay, and so to get into the actual Q&A for you, one concern, let me get to the top. So there's a concern about getting scooped, right? So how can you be sure that reviewers are not stealing your proposal idea? How can you protect it? Are there actual possibilities? Is there a way maybe that you can address in your proposal the opportunity to involve people so that maybe they don't want to just take your idea from you? Or is there a way to appeal to the individual handling the grant management? What would you advise, or how would you acquiesce people that are very concerned about getting scooped?
So I don't think you should necessarily be super concerned about being scooped. I mean, of course, there are, as I said, fiercely competitive research groups against one another. Again, kind of taking the advice that we had from our top proposal reviewer, you can list your conflicts of interest when you do your proposal. So that would be those competitive people that you think may steal your idea. You do have to provide justification for why that is the case. You can't just provide a long list of names. I do also know for a fact that if you are someone that is on a panel that's in a room with others reviewing these proposals in real time, if you have a conflict of interest associated with the proposal, you are asked to leave the room, and you would have never even received that proposal in the first place. So the funding agencies do kind of try to protect you as a researcher and make sure that that is something that doesn't happen. So again, I think that providing as much information as you can, specifically worried about folks that are working on the exact same thing as you, again, listing them and contacting the program officer about those sort of issues is something that you should feel free to do.
Absolutely. I think it's also a case of you really don't have a lot of ownership of your ideas in science. So if you want to put something out there and participate in the scientific community, you have to be open to the idea that you're sharing your idea with other people that are going to take it and utilize it. So do it well, try to do it better than others, and it will be yours. But if somebody else can do something better than you, you don't truly have ownership of that to that extent. So just do the best you can with it. And you should be able to avoid getting scooped because you are in the lead. You already have a bit of an advantage there.
Yes. Yeah, that's true. If you're also not incredibly competitive against them or against working with them, if you have the idea and they have the better technique that would provide the best outcome, you can think about collaborating with that individual to make an even stronger, more competitive proposal.
Excellent. The other question, so this is a really good one because we're talking about funding here. People are worried also not just about writing the proposal, but where to find funding. So recommendations for sites for external funding. Can you mention ResearchGate and talk about how that might be useful? You see in the chat, people are already sharing their ideas and their backgrounds here, and there are platforms for that. If you want to start with ResearchGate, and then I can actually highlight PeerRef as well as another option.
Yeah, in all honesty, when I was a researcher, I did use platforms to really share research. I was a member of ResearchGate. It was, at the time, an exciting way for all of us to, get our ideas out there and be able to identify funding options. There are a few other databases that are out there that you can filter for your specific disciplines. Again, I think you're going to talk about one of those that's up and coming. But I actually found most of my funding opportunities through the help of my advisor, so which actually pointed me to a lot of specific funding opportunities. I was a member of ResearchGate, but I actually did not utilize it too much. So you actually may be someone that's better for that component.
Yes. I brought that up also because there's a sort of related question about how do I find people to collaborate on proposals and stuff.
Oh,
so
okay.
Finding funding, finding people to collaborate and that type of things. Another one is Nature. So Nature has funding opportunities available. Yep. If you go check them out, they'll be able to do it. I'll just highlight PeerRef as an example. So I'm going to screen share with you real quick. So something like PeerRef, again, consistent with other platforms, and I would encourage you not to just use one platform. Adopt every platform there is because it's going to be the most comprehensive for you, and most of them are quite easy to join. So you simply go ahead, go to my account, register, set yourself up. It takes just a minute, and then one like ResearchGate has journals, publications, that type of thing, and also you can see something like this funding at the top that's going to be coming soon. A lot of platforms have things like these. So that you can search across agencies, because of course you can go directly to the agency, but then you might be going to thousands of them in order to get an idea of what's out there. So platforms like this that do have a funding type component, any sort of database where you can search, that helps you deal with like eligibility issues because they're of course going to list that type of information, which is another question. And somewhere like here, when that's all together in one place, this is also an opportunity to collaborate. So a lot of people are leaving their information in chat, letting people know that they're open to collaboration, which I think is great. These platforms are a great way to do that. Log into a platform like this, ResearchGate, Nature, whatever, sign up, it takes a minute, and then you can go on leave comments on your own paper, let people know you're open to collaboration, that type of thing. And that's how you can start sort of that networking, and you'll find out ideas for some of your funding opportunities. So I just want to share that real quickly. Moving on in our Q&A. Sorry, I keep scrolling to the bottom.
Yeah, we have quite a few questions in the Q&A. Thank you everyone for being so engaging.
Yes. We might glide through a few of these really quick just to get to as many as possible. Here's a question about budget. So essentially the question is, do you budget to the full amount, or does that look bad? Should you be budgeting to underneath that full amount with like a cushion, or should you be demonstrating that you can utilize all the money? What's your suggestion on the delicacy of demonstrating that you're capable of doing it, you have enough money to do it, but also not acting like, oh, there's going to be left over, I don't really need this whole grant?
Okay, well, number one is that you are never going to receive more money than you budget for. So down to the, dollar or cent that you budget for, that is what the agency is going to provide you. So most importantly, you cannot budget too low. That's not that in a way that you're not going to be able to receive the funds that is going to make your research successful. It's different than, say, a job negotiation offer where there might be wiggle room down the road after you give the, the first offer or counter to receiving an offer. You need to be very explicit. I would say it's a very, very tricky question because different research all costs a lot of very different amounts. But again, as long as you justify your budget very clearly and make everything extremely detailed, it should be clear that you need the amount of money that you're budgeting for. The main reason that budgets get too high, I think I mentioned this, was because of salary component. If you're a faculty member, you may understand that students are very expensive, and so is, summer salary for you or additional salary for you. So that might be something that you have to end up cutting down in order to make your budget more affordable. But in terms of cutting down the number of analyses or data or kind of things that are related to logistics, that stuff is a little bit more concrete, a little bit more stable. So when you develop a budget, do those really stable things first, get those down, get the justification, be really explicit and detailed about those, and then tack on the things that can be kind of cut if necessary. And that might be, instead of having a PhD student, you have a master's student. They'll be less expensive because they'll be at the university for a fewer number of years. Instead of having 3 months summer salary, only have 1.5. So again, I think you just need to be as realistic as possible.
Excellent. A quick one that I'll address, is it possible to have future presentations on statistics? Of course, we've done some statistics presentations. We'll continue to do some in the future. We're also looking to put together maybe some short courses that go into detailed statistical education that you guys can use for continuing education type credits. So yes, we will be working on those in the future. And if you ever have suggestions, just go ahead and send them to us. A quick question for you, Avi. How is it okay to use published data for preliminary results? So rather than just presenting as part of the literature review, actually saying like, here's data that acts as like a pilot study, even though it's actually published data? How would you put that in?
Oh, yes, that's definitely okay, especially if it's something that you plan to build on. Especially if you're a researcher, and as you would in a manuscript, say, our previous work shows this, and then this manuscript builds on that. You can do the exact same thing in a proposal. Again, though, you need to make sure that your proposed work is not just continuing your previous study. You need to have, spin it in a little bit of a different way to entice the reviewers to fund you.
And I just realized they might be asking related to like, is it okay to like, because it's published, to like reuse it type thing? And of course, like, so a grant proposal is not like a new publication or anything. The idea of like, oh, I presented at a conference, can I do it somewhere else? Absolutely, you can put, so like if you want to like redo a figure that was originally in the published one, you want to like revise it for the grant proposal, that's fine. The grant proposal is not subject to any like copyright rules or anything like that. Um, how do you deal with the limitations, AV, in terms of like delicacy, like making sure that they're upfront and so that the reviewer knows that you know, and they're not mad that you didn't recognize something that's obviously limiting without being like sort of ruining your whole proposal and just having it be so limited? How do you deal with the language of that type of thing?
Okay, so that would be something that you want to put within your research design. You set yourself up kind of in the literature review, being like, these are some of the issues that the community as a whole is trying to address. And then you would move forward with your approach to address that. You always want to say, I always kind of go with like the bad news first and then the good news. So like you say, you know, my experiment may not address the huge question, but we are making steps forward with using this technique. And then again, you would say our technique outshines these other techniques because of A, B, and C. You just need to provide, again, I think at some point in the presentation, I said that you can't just say something that is important. You have to say, kind of go that next step, say why something is important, but why it's going to make a difference. You need to do that too with the limitations. You can't just say, you don't ever want to kind of end a paragraph or a section of your proposal on a negative or kind of low, less impactful statement, such as, we're going to do all this stuff, but there are limitations to that. You want to turn that around and be like, our work may not, you know, solve the main question, but we are contributing to moving it forward with using this technique. It's, again, as you said, it's something about the language that you use. But again, a reviewer will be able to identify a limitation in your research, you know, right off the bat because they're within your field. So it is better for you to be upfront about that limitation rather than trying to say, you know, cover it up, not mention it or something like that. That would be a red flag.
Yeah, you want to adhere to their expectations, their norms, make you feel like you're a colleague of theirs, and that you know the problems just like they know the problems. They want to recognize. So perfect. Okay. Another one that I think is quite good, and you sort of addressed it, like talking about like utilizing your previous research and maybe like you're changing directions for your first submission, like after your PhD, going to a postdoc, something like that. So what's some advice for dealing with that when you're maybe going to a topic that's like outside your research and you're worried that they're going to think like, oh, well, this isn't even like your thing as a scientist. This isn't your topic. You're going to something very different than what you have published on. What can you do to highlight that you're capable, that you're going to be able to do the work in that field?
That's a really good question. I think in terms of writing a proposal and getting one funded, if you're looking to make kind of a career path change or just a detour perhaps, the best way to do that is to collaborate with someone that's within that field that you want to go for. So if say that you just finished your dissertation, you know, you were interested in what you were doing, but you want to take that somewhere else for your postdoc, I would suggest that you find a postdoc advisor or mentor that is in that direction of your field. And then you can use the skills that you learned in your dissertation towards learning that new skill. And then you have that collaborative proposal moving forward.
Yeah, absolutely. That's what I would say as well, because you can't do anything. You may have published and done an excellent job, but they're like, well, you don't have a paper specifically on what you're doing right now. Just pull someone into this circle with you. Science is supposed to be collaborative. Allow them to be your sort of robust background for that specific topic that you're getting into. Because there's probably that person anyway. If you feel comfortable moving, it's probably because you have excellent colleagues. So put one of those colleagues in. This is about keywords for the abstract and like getting assigned the correct reviewers, which I think keywords is important, but I also think title is maybe what they're looking at first. So can you talk a little bit about like what you think a reviewer is looking at first to get, or sorry, what like the grant manager is looking at first to select someone to go to when they're choosing reviewers, and then how to sort of emphasize each one, how the keywords can be used in conjunction with the title, not just repeating the title, to sort of enhance that person's understanding of who this should really go to for review.
Yeah, so I guess to provide some context on that, you know, you have your main funding agency, and then within the funding agency, there are programs, and then within those programs, there may even be, you know, departments, the same sort of thing that a university has colleges and then departments within that. And those program officers that are in charge of those, say, departments or smaller areas, kind of already have a list of reviewers that are going to be suitable for that kind of material. Once they read your proposal, they're going to, of course, try to align the proposal with someone who is definitely an expert within your field. But that is for some, that might be for a couple different reasons. They might choose somebody that is an expert in the exact method or instrument or technique that you're using for your approach. And then they may also want somebody who is been, for their research, addressing the same research question, but from a different avenue, from using kind of a different technique or method. And then they might choose somebody that is going to understand your research, but doesn't necessarily fit directly within your field to kind of provide that outsider component. So when they read your abstract, they're going to be thinking of kind of reviewers that are diverse for a sort of a different kind of panel to provide an encompassing or overall view of your work. Could you repeat the title component question?
So just the title as part of that. How my instinct is I'm looking at the title to get topic, right? Like, what is this about? Who's going to be best to review this? Keywords, abstract, all that type of stuff. But a good title tells that person a lot right away, and it's in bold and large font, so it's usually the first thing they see. So just the importance of using that in conjunction with with your keywords. Of course,
a really important component of a title is that the title actually discusses or describes what your proposal is actually about. So you need to make sure that your title doesn't oversell or undersell, or is absolutely appropriate for your proposal. This is a big issue. You can't, your title is going to often say, what you're studying, how you're studying it, like what kind of technique or method you're using, if you are in, a geographic location, something like that. And sometimes it also says, the big take-home point. But if that information, isn't supported with the rest of the proposal, that won't be good. So just make sure that your title has, again, all those keywords that are going to really grab the program officer, they're going to grab the reviewers, but is also incredibly appropriate for your research as well.
Yeah, definitely identify what you are concerned about, because a lot of times what we see with our authors as well, who contract us for editorial support, they're saying like, oh, this reviewer doesn't know this. Well, if you know what you're concerned about, the type of people you don't want reviewing it, make sure it goes into the title if possible. For example, in my field, a lot of people say, oh, they don't know my model. They don't know my preclinical animal model of congestive chronic heart failure, right? Well, if you want that, if that's a major concern, that's the biggest problem with a reviewer not understanding your work, make sure your model shows up in your title somewhere, or shows up in your keywords, or shows up very prominently in your abstract.
Right, exactly.
You can preempt it by identifying the people that you think are unqualified and making sure that information is somewhere so that the person sees, okay, it must be that the model is an important component of this, and so I'm going to make sure I match someone that has experience with the model. Excellent. How many more do you want, Avi? Because we're running a bit short on time. We still have close to 100 questions, so we're obviously not going to get through all of them.
It's great to know that our attendees are so interested. Maybe just one or two questions.
Yeah, let me give you one more. Let me find a good one that I think encompasses a few people's. So a question about not having specific reviewers. There's several related questions, but the idea is, one, sometimes you don't know the reviewer, and so you can't really tell if there's a conflict of interest. You don't really have a lot of control over it. And two, maybe you do get a reviewer, you know that they really shouldn't be reviewing it, or you think you don't want them reviewing it. What sort of recourse maybe do you have? Is there a way to preempt it? Is there recourse once you get into it in terms of reaching out and explaining your concern to the person in charge of that grant process? What's your advice?
A really good question. Again, like, it is the researcher's responsibility, the one drafting the proposal, to write any conflicts of interest. But another component of this is that it's the program officer's job also to be aware of any conflicts of interest. They're going to have your CVs, your resumes, and they're going to be able to see who you've collaborated with and what recent publications you've had. And most likely the program officer, this isn't someone who's just in an administrative role. They're someone that's from your community, most likely. So they're aware of, the who's who of your research, and they're probably a pretty high-powered professor. So they should be able to, you know, they're there to help you for a variety of different reasons. And they also have the responsibility to make sure that your research is not unfairly reviewed. With that in mind, if you do feel that you receive an unfair review, that is something that you can contact the program officer for to express your concern. I can't say that necessarily your appeal is going to make your proposal get funded, but you at least indicate that perhaps for future proposals that you have down the road, that you've identified somebody who unfairly reviewed your work, and that you would prefer that they are put on your conflict of interest list.
Yes, absolutely. And specify why. Like, don't if the
absolutely, yeah.
If the person you're going to, if your appeal seems like it's coming from a place of I'm just upset that they didn't accept it, that I didn't get the grant, that's not. They're going to say, okay, whatever. You know, that's part of it. Make sure you emphasize why, that it's not reactionary, that you realize this person shouldn't have reviewed it before you even find out what their decision is, whether they supported you or didn't support you. Regardless, they probably weren't a good choice, and why that's a major issue. Not that you're just upset that it didn't get funded. So, because otherwise they'll dismiss it out of hand.
Right. Justification is really like the key to a proposal. You have to justify everything.
Yes, absolutely. We're going to have to leave it off here. We have still close to 100 questions in the Q&A. So often what we'll do in these situations is do a follow-up, maybe an open forum, so that you guys can purely ask questions, and we can just spend about an hour session just answering these concerns, helping you deal with more specific problems. So look for us to maybe do something like this in the future. Perhaps we can put together smaller ones as well. Perhaps there'll be very small paid sessions where we can get people together. We can answer your questions in a more collaborative way to help you with again, individual concerns. But I do apologize that we can't get to all the questions. It's simply too much. We'd end up being here for the next half of the day. But we definitely want to thank you for joining us today. Did you have anything closing, AV?
No, it's great to have so many attendees with us, and to have some returning attendees as well. So that's wonderful. Yeah, again, I'm really thankful that everyone joined, and we look forward to having you attend our future webinars.
Absolutely. So we're going to close you out now. What I would encourage you to do is go ahead and go find the on-demand. Again, just click on the link to go right back to it. Because it's closed out now, it's going to take you to the on-demand recording where you'll be able to view it. We don't have PowerPoint slides, so you're not going to be getting those, but you get the full recording, everything we've just gone through. If you need a certificate, there's going to be an email sent to you, and it'll have our email address that you can request that certificate for. We'll also try to get that up in future webinars, so it's something you can simply click into. But for now, we will be able to send it to you manually in that regard. And again, please check out PeerRef. It's one of our sponsors. It's great if you go and check them out. Also, it seems like a lot of people, what they think that they like to do here in chat, the sharing, the collaborative nature, PeerRef is the perfect platform for you. So definitely go there, check it out. It's easy to sign up. You can spend a couple minutes exploring around. So, but that's it for us today. Look for our next webinar announcement. It'll go up on the site. If you're on our email list, you'll get an email for it. And we should have an exciting topic for that next one. So thank you, AV. We're going to head out now. So enjoy the rest of your day. And we'll see you next time.
All right. See you guys.